Terry, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
Good, Adam. How are you?
I'm doing well. We're going to jump in the Wayback Machine 30 years. If you can stand the visit, we're going to go back to when you're working on Iron Man and Avengers. But I'm curious, I was looking at the timeline. So you're working on Web of Spider-Man, and then I guess you get this opportunity to work on the Avengers. I'm curious how that came about.
Good question. All of this is dependent on my memory, which isn't perfect. But if I remember correctly, Bob Harris was writing the Avengers, but sort of needed help with it. Didn't want to be the sole plotter and scripter. So they brought me on board to work with him. I think as much as anything, I was needed as a nudge. I was the one who would nudge him to, let's get together, let's talk about the next issue, let's figure out what it is, and then I'll put it on paper. So we would work out the stories together, and then I would get in front of my, probably a word processor at the time. I don't even think it was a computer.
When you're working on a project like that, and again, like when you're kind of brought into something where someone else has already been on a book for a while and you're kind of working with them, how do you approach it from a collaborative nature in terms of trying to plot out like story beats when it comes to kind of long-term planning? Is it more your ideas that are kind of percolating there, or is it more coming from Bob, or how much of a kind of homogenization did you guys have?
It was both of our ideas. Bob and I were and still are very good friends, so it was something easy for us. We could meet. He lived actually 2 blocks away from my apartment, so we could just meet after work over drinks and say, oh, what about this happening, or we have to resolve this issue that we introduced. And I believe as it went along, I took a little more of the lead. When it first started, I was really just there to help him, but then Bob was always, and I'm not talking out of school on this, he would be the first to admit it, he was always a reluctant writer. He was a very, very, very good writer, but he didn't like doing it. So, and I was still relatively fresh to it and not burnt out yet. So it was probably a little more exciting for me.
In the offices at the time, and we've talked about this before, granted it was 10 years ago, but we were talking about how at the time, obviously, X-Men seemed to get a lot of the oxygen at Marvel in terms of, its marketing, a lot of the, the kind of the creative talent that would kind of go towards X-books, and then obviously the Spider-Man books as well. When you're working on something like Avengers and Iron Man, especially at the time, how much of it was, really trying to get more of the oxygen back?
Certainly that was the goal with any book that we worked on, from the editor to the writer to the penciler to the inker, colorist, letterer, etc. That was the goal all along, was to make really good stories that the readers would enjoy and talk about and buzz about. For me, and I think this held true for Bob as well, Avengers was one of my favorite comics, and Iron Man probably was my favorite comic book growing up. Iron Man and Batman, because both of them you really could grow up to be. You didn't need to get bitten by a radioactive spider. You just had to make a couple of $1 billion, and then it would be fine. So I loved Iron Man, always had, and I loved the Avengers. And I was probably more invested in the Avengers than I was in X-Men, to be honest.
For sure. Now, at this time, so you come on the book, you're working, I'm speaking of Avengers, you're working on Avengers with Bob, and then where were you in the process when they say, oh, by the way, do you want to succeed Len on Iron Man?
I don't know exactly where I was in the process. I know that Nell Yomtov is the one who offered it to me. I believe Mike Martz was his assistant at the time. I'm not sure why they were moving Len off the book. It might have been Len's choice. I'm not sure if it was an editorial decision or Len's decision. Mm-hmm. And it probably just made sense to them to have someone who's working on the Avengers title do Iron Man for crossover reasons. And also, the crossing was going to have such a big impact on Iron Man particularly that they probably wanted that energy going back and forth between the two books.
Absolutely. I mean, it definitely makes sense to have that, someone who's working on both and is very kind of aware of both to kind of chart out where you're going. When you guys start plotting out what becomes the crossing, I'm curious, obviously it made sense that it has to be in Iron Man, it has to be in Avengers, and then Force Works, is kind of the West Coast Avengers stand-in at the time. It was the next evolution. Mm-hmm. And then you also have War Machine. Was there ever any discussion about trying to, figure out a way to get, Captain America or Thor into the book as well? Or did it just kind of make sense where those characters were at those times with who was working on them at the time to just kind of keep them separate?
So a lot of it had to do with the editorial setup at Marvel at the time. And I it was probably Mark Gruenwald was editing the Avengers at the time. And I don't, Thor was edited in a different office. I'm pretty sure that was Ralph Macchio's office, and probably Captain America as well, because Mark couldn't edit Captain America when he was writing Captain America. So it just became more complicated if you started doing it with three different offices working together. And the other editors didn't always want to be involved in those crossovers. They had their own stories going that they were excited about, and they had worked with their writers and artists with for quite a while, and didn't necessarily want to interrupt the momentum they had going on their own books to be included in something that was going to be a little more unwieldy.
Now, we talk again about the idea of kind of trying to tap into what the X-Men had done. So obviously they had really popularized kind of the inner office crossover at the time. So when you have the crossing, you do have two one-shots. You got the crossing and Time Slide. I'm curious, how early in the process did you know that you're going to get extra kind of real estate to kind of explore these stories, both at the beginning and kind of middle near the end with these crossover one-shots?
I honestly can't answer that. My best guess would be it would have to do with production schedules. The editor-in-chief often came to us and said, or would have a big editorial meeting and say, our publishing schedule needs another couple of books in November. Anybody have anything to offer? And when I was the editor on Marvel Comics Presents, I was often able to help out with that, because I might have an 8-part Eternals storyline planned for Marvel Comics Presents that could be then turned into 164-page special. But all the editors tried to do what they could in those moments. So possibly they looked and said, all right, we have an event coming up. Why not have some bookended special editions for that? I'm guessing that's the way it went down.
Makes sense. Now, looking at it, it's interesting because, on the credits for, the Crossing, for example, the actual one-shot, Bob is credited as the editor-in-chief, whereas the Avengers book at the time, as you mentioned, is still under, Mark Gruenwald as, kind of his office. How often did that end up happening where, a special project like that wouldn't be under the main office that's doing most of the books? So wait, you're saying in The Crossing there was no editor credited, just an editor-in-chief? I believe so. I'm just double-checking to be sure, because I think there was a bunch of different... That would surprise me. It would? Okay. Yeah, that would really surprise me. I can't remember any example of a title not having its own editor. Okay. I'm looking at... It's possible... It's possible it just got left out of the credits. We can't rule that out. So I'm checking it now. So it says, The Crossing by Bob Harris and Terry Kavanagh. Mike Deodato in studio did art. And then on editor, Ralph Macchio. And then Bob Harris, chief. Yeah, okay. So Ralph was the editor of that title. Then. Interesting. But it's interesting, but it wasn't, I guess, under Mark's overall kind of his spot of Marvel at the time, even though he was editing the Avengers books. Like it's a fascinating period because obviously there were so many chiefs during this period. Correct?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I couldn't tell you why Mark wasn't the editor on that book. It's possible he was tied up with doing the handbook. That often took over the lives of that office when they were doing updates on the handbook, etc. Because that was I did a few issues of the handbook myself in my editorial office, and it was grueling. But I'm not sure why it wouldn't have been Mark.
Yeah, it does seem odd. Yeah.
Yeah.
So questions about, again, the crossing. So, I mean, it's well known for what happened with Tony at the time. Reading it over again, it's interesting how you kind of set up Tony, and you set up that, obviously there's something wrong, which does kind of build off of a lot of what Len had been doing as well. So it didn't feel out of left field. I think people are way too way too harsh on the overall storyline. How early, when you're kind of plotting it out and developing it, were you sure that you were going to bring, kind of Kang in as the main impetus for what happens to Tony?
My guess is Bob knew most of that from the beginning. And I have to say I was a little resistant to Tony going bad like that. But the way it developed, he had his redemption arc. He had his moment. We came up with what we thought was a clever way. The only one who could beat Tony Stark is Tony Stark. We also were aware that Tony was one of the characters that presented as older than a lot of our other characters. It might have been the mustache. It might have been the billionaire status. I'm not really sure. We were aware that somehow he was older than most of the Marvel superheroes, or presented that way at least. So that's probably what led to Team Tony. And it was meant to stick, as much as everything was meant to stick in those days, but we all knew when we were writing a title, or even editing a title, that the next writer or editor to come along could undo anything that was done. We all knew that. I mean, when we were doing the Clone Saga, it was meant to be that Ben Reilly was going to be revealed as the real Spider-Man, and we would write Peter and Mary Jane off into the sunset with a happy ending, a pregnancy, etc. But the editor-in-chief changed after that, and he is the one who changed his mind. So we all knew whatever we were working on was subject to the whims of the next team.
When you're working on a character like Iron Man, obviously a big kind of hallmark of the character is that periodically he'll have a new, suit of armor of any kind. So when you do take over the book, there is almost instantly there is a change to the armor. Was that something that would have come from you, trying to wanting to do something different with the character, or was that more of an artistic input at that point in time?
It would have come from me, but more often than not, with Iron Man specifically, any new artists wanted to do their take on him, their version of him visually, and he was a character that lent himself to that. You were still going to recognize him as Iron Man, whether he had a nose or not. So it allowed for it, and it allowed for keeping the character fresh, too. And as someone who was a futurist and was creating his own armor, I would think he'd want to update it every other day. It actually made story sense to do that, as long as we didn't stray too far from the recognizable brand look.
When you're writing, the Avengers of this era, obviously, it's a very unique squad. Who were the characters that you were most enjoying kind of writing with Bob?
I really enjoyed Madame Mask. I thought it was his idea, totally his idea, and I thought that was neat because I always liked the character. I liked her as a villain. I liked what we could do with her within there. I liked the friction it brought to the team. It's never much fun to write, or for that matter to read, about a team that has no friction, that they're all one big happy family. Drama comes from trouble. Drama comes from trouble more often than not. So to plant her in the middle of it gave us a lot to work with.
Now, one of the big things that was definitely memorable at the time was the change that the Wasp undergoes during the Crossing storyline. Again, where did that kind of idea come from to kind of mutate her and do something very radical and different with the character at that time?
Well, so she was a character, since she didn't have her own book, we had more freedom to experiment with and do different things with. I'm pretty sure that was never meant to be a permanent change. Somewhere in the back of my mind, it was that this was going to allow Hank to have a sort of redemption arc of being able to cure her and bring her back to what she had been. But again, we always had more freedom with the characters that didn't have their own books. So those were the ones we could make the most drastic changes to, whether they were going to be permanent or not. But we were always considering how it was going to affect the relationships amongst different characters in any title we were working on.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I'm curious about, because I'm curious if it came from you or if it came from Abnett and Lanning, who were doing Forceworks at the time, is obviously they had included a new character, Moonraker, and they had done a fair bit with that character over a relatively short period. And then during the elements of the Crossing, we find out that it's completely different. It's not really the Moonraker we think the character that they had established, but it's actually connected in with Mantis. Was that something that kind of came from you? Was that something that they had kind of pitched as a way of kind of integrating that character into the broader narrative of the Crossing?
I wish I could tell you. Most likely it was something they came up with, because again, even though you didn't want to be totally in on whatever story was being told in a crossover book like that, you wanted to have impact, and you wanted to reflect back onto your title, and you wanted your title to impact the broader one. So my guess is they suggested something like that, although I'm pretty sure Bob was the one who wanted Mantis's involvement. And again, I love that, because I love those old Steve Englehart stories where, she married a tree.
Absolutely. Now, there comes a point where, as some of these issues are coming out, that you're credited more as being plot and not necessarily doing script. There's, for example, Iron Man 324. I think Dan Abnett does the script. That issue probably has one of the most visually, not upsetting, that's the wrong word, but oh my God, what's happening kind of first page of any of these issues, where you open up the book and you have Iron Man, twisting someone's neck. Now, it turns out it's a robot, so it's okay. But it's very arresting.
It was Machine Smith.
Exactly, Machine Smith. Was that something that you kind of, how much trying to push the envelope were you trying to do at that time? Because it definitely got my attention.
Well, look, if we were telling that story where he had gone bad for whatever reasons, I was all in on telling that story. I wasn't going to try and mitigate it or dilute it in any way or form, so dive right in. And that's certainly a dramatic opening scene. Mm-hmm. And you'll always strive for that.
Absolutely. Now, if I go back to the actual Crossing one-shot for a second, so I believe the art is credited to Mike Deodato. I'm curious about this because I believe this is the issue that we get a new version of Scarlet Witch's costume, which was something I always really loved. It didn't last long, obviously. Then when she disappeared and eventually came back after Heroes Reborn, she was restored to a more kind of classic style with George Perez drawing it. I'm curious, was that something that was an input from you, or is again that coming more from artists first wanting to try to add a new flavor to the character for this one shot?
I'm sorry, what character are you talking about?
Scarlet Witch.
Scarlet Witch. Oh, as was sort of obvious at that point, there was a bit of a visual nod to X-Men going on with them wearing their leather jackets, mm-hmm. etc. And we didn't necessarily want to do that with every character, but we wanted to keep those characters fresh. I can't tell you whether that came from Bob and I or from Deodato, but, Deodato was and is a visual master. So there would have been no resistance on our part if that stemmed from him.
I gotta say, I always loved the leather jackets. Both X-Men, Avengers, didn't matter. I just love seeing it on those characters. I can't explain why. Maybe it's just the age I was at that point, but it's always been something I loved.
Yeah, because they're cool.
That's right. So as you get closer to, so I guess obviously you guys knew, Iron Man 325 is going to be a big moment. You're going to have him, damage the younger version of himself. It's interesting. Like then you have the death of an Avenger, the death of Iron Man occur not in an Iron Man book proper. We have it take place in Avengers. How much conversation was there about where to put that death?
That deserved to be in Avengers because that was the event. That was the culmination of the Avengers storyline. So I don't think there was any resistance, and I was excited about the fact that I was going to have a whole new approach to Tony Stark after this, and it was going to recapture. I was going to be able to recapture his youthful spirit and inventiveness, and sort of shed any of the jaded aspects of Tony Stark at that point. So I didn't particularly care if that scene happened in Iron Man or Avengers, especially since I was involved in both books. It just deserved to be in the Avengers.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Now, I'm curious about when you have that time slide one shot, which is a lot of fun. And I remember as a kid, it was probably one of the first Avengers books I ever read, and I really dug it. It felt like you were having a lot of fun playing with the fact that you were in an earlier continuity. So there's a bunch of nods to characters. You have Peter Parker. We just see him briefly he's out with Uncle Ben and Aunt May. We have obviously Matt Murdock has a little bit more of a part to play. What level of fun and coordination was there to be able to explore an earlier Marvel Universe just before the FF go up? Because I think they even mentioned that the FF are about to, go into space or something that is about to happen. So what was it like to kind of play in that moment, but have these characters, trying to figure out what to do now that they're back in time?
Oh, I love that. I always loved what really attracted me to the Marvel Universe over the DC Universe when I was young is that it presented as a more cohesive universe. You could be reading an issue of Spider-Man and Thor would just fly by overhead. He might not be involved in the story, but you got this sense that there was a real world where all these people interacted. So for something like that, that was just fun to be able to do. I'm sure we had to run it through the Fantastic Four office, through the Spider-Man office, through the Daredevil office, but we weren't doing anything that was going to interfere with their characters' continuity. It was just a reminder that they'd all been around, even if they weren't heroes yet at that point. Mm-hmm. I love that kind of stuff, so I was all in on that.
Now, in Iron Man 325, as we kind of previously mentioned, you have this big showdown between the two Tonys. I'm curious, how far did you position going even further in terms of just how brutal the fight is and how much he hurts Tony? And it obviously is a perfect way to kind of set up Teen Tony to also have a heart issue that he has to deal with kind of bringing it back to the original Iron Man. So I'm curious what it was like to kind of develop and write that issue.
Can't really remember specifics because we had been planning it for so long. We were working towards it for so long that I'm pretty sure little details got introduced months before, and then, maybe 4 months before, and then again 3 months we might have added another detail. So by the time we got to there, we knew what we were going to do in that issue.
Now, when you have, when that occurs, where we have Iron Man, make his sacrifice in the issue of Avengers, and then you have the Age of Innocence, the Rebirth of Iron Man as a one shot. Again, I'm curious what the decisions were to put some things not in the main book, but have them in the one shots. Is it more kind of marketing driven and sales driven at that point, or do you just want the enhanced page count to be able to do more of an in-depth exploration of Iron Man before we kind of set up the new status quo?
If you're going to do special editions like that, stuff needs to happen. You can't just do that as a sort of throwaway story. If you're doing it in a more of a prestige format or with more of a page count, there's going to be higher expectations from the audience. And what we never wanted to do was disappoint the audience. If they were along for the ride with us, and if we got them hyped up by doing a special edition, we were going to give them something special.
Absolutely. Makes sense. Now, I'm curious. So, again, when I was rereading kind of the Teen Tony era, what I was struck by is that it is a lot of fun. That you're trying to put new pieces in play, do something different, new status quo, new characters, supporting cast. It is a lot of fun. It is interesting to me, and I'm curious how you felt about it at the time, that, you have your first issue with him really taking over in 326, but it's part 3 of a storyline that happens in other books. And obviously this happened a lot at that, time at Marvel, really in comics in general. But how did you feel about having to kind of balance starting a new status quo, introducing new elements, and then also being part of a storyline in 2 other books?
That was my job. And it was, in a weird way, it was part of the fun of my job. I got to play off stuff people were doing in other titles. I could use that as grist for stories myself. So there were almost 2 schools of thought from editors and creators. A lot of them felt hampered by continuity. And they felt like, I can't, just because this happened 32 years ago on a panel in Avengers 17, I don't want to have to be constrained by that anymore. I always took the opposite approach. To me, that was story to be mined. If it was something that was out there already, I never, as a writer, had to face a blank page. I really didn't. Not only was it a collaborative medium where I'd be talking to the editor and the artist, but there was a history to the characters I was writing that I could mine for more stories. I hate to go back to this again, but the Clone Saga, that's what that was about. We had written as we aged, the creative teams aged and got mortgages and got married. We did that with Peter Parker, and we wrote him away from our core audience. So we would have editorial meetings, and we would say, do we divorce them, Mary Jane and Peter? Do we widow, do we kill Mary Jane? All of that would have added more baggage to Spider-Man and actually aged him more. So I remembered this storyline from when I was a kid, the Jerry Conway, I think it was a 2-parter that originally introduced the clone, and I never could have articulated this when I was a kid, but by this point, I realized part of what was fascinating about that story is a clone of Spider-Man is a good guy. So it wasn't good guy versus bad guy. It was 2 good guys in a bad position. And so that led me to think, we can use this to solve our Spider-Man problem organically. We can do this organically, and everything would be organic. When we wrote Peter and Mary Jane off into the sunset with the pregnancy, it would be Peter being true to his, with great power comes great responsibility, and now that responsibility is to my family. We could just do it without forcing something on the characters and the readers that might not have been received very well. And arguably, the Clone Saga by the end was not received very well, but when it was planned, I'm sorry to stray from Avengers, when it was planned, there were 4 Spider-Man books, and this whole thing was going to take place over 3 months in those books, 12 issues, and Ben Reilly we'd have a single Spider-Man who'd never finished school and could be exposed to Venom and all these other characters for the first time and have fresh takes on those. It was the fact that it got dragged out, I like to believe, is why the story got so vilified at the time.
I very much agree with that, and I've always really been a fan of the Clone Saga period, so I'm never going to say anything bad about it. I mean, I definitely did enjoy it. To go back to Iron Man and the Crossing for a second, when you have Teen Tony and you have this fresh new storyline, were you involved with getting Jim Chung on the book? Because he felt like the right artist at the right time that really brought a youthful vitality to this character that you're establishing as a much younger person. So I'm curious how you felt kind of seeing his pages come in, and how much did you kind of lean into what he was giving you visually?
I had nothing at all to do with bringing him on the book, but I could not have been happier. I loved, the Marvel method was we would write a plot, not full script like DC did. We would write a plot, it would go to the artist, the pencils would come back to the writer, to dialogue. And there are very few artists that I worked with that were easier to dial up. He left the space for it. He covered the action so well, I didn't have to put in unnecessary words describing what wasn't necessarily there in the art. Every time I got pages back from him, I was thrilled, and it was always better than what I had imagined in my head.
Now, an interesting thing happens, obviously, when you're writing, Teen Tony. Like, you come on, you're doing this big crossover, now you got this new, fun new status quo you get to write, but it doesn't last very long because obviously things are happening within the company that are going to move the characters, out of being even operated by, the regular Marvel crew. How early on did you find out about this?
Not very early on. That was a bit of a shock to a lot of creators, to be honest. We were suddenly told, it's not anything you're doing, we're just farming these characters and these books out to the Image guys. I understood the business aspect of that. I wasn't 100% sure it was the best idea for Marvel to suggest out loud to people that for really exciting adventures, they were going to have to go outside Marvel to other talent. I thought they were doing more for Image than Image was really doing for us. No, I loved all those Image guys. I'd worked with all of them, and I was very happy for their success, but I certainly didn't want Marvel to suffer for it. But we were not... That was business stuff. That was 11th floor stuff. We were 10th floor. So obviously the editor-in-chief was involved in it, but he wasn't talking about it. That wasn't part of the plan to let everyone know. So we were informed pretty much when we were taken off the books.
When that's about to happen, I mean, again, the last issue that you do is, tied in with Onslaught. Were you given at least advance notice about being part of this Onslaught event, and how much kind of direction were you given? I mean, you don't get, unfortunately, to do a lot with it. You have a little bit with the Sentinels besieging New York, but you don't really get to delve much more into it with Iron Man. Was that just more of a scheduling issue in terms of when they wanted Iron Man to actually be part of that event?
Yeah, probably. It was more of a scheduling issue, and it became more of sort of what happened at Marvel with the lead into the first Secret Wars, where really we didn't have, if you were writing Fantastic Four or any of the books and the lead into Secret Wars, you didn't have to know anything about Secret Wars. You just had to know your issue that month was going to end with a blinding white flash of light, and then they were going to be off somewhere else. It was pretty much the same. We knew that this was all going to stem out of the Onslaught storyline, this whole Heroes Reborn thing. So we just had to get our characters into that.
As someone who had been, a big fan of the Avengers and also of Iron Man, like when you see them kind of leave Marvel proper, did you read any of those books at the time, or was it just painful or just not something you were interested in doing? Oh,
no. Of course I read them. I'm a comic book fan. I still read comic books. I still read them all the time. It embarrasses my kids when I do it on the subway in front of other people with my gray-white hair. But I love comics. I've always loved comics. I always will love comics. And there are a lot of what you're speaking about. I know a lot of writers who, once they stop writing a title, they never look at it again. I'm not that disciplined.
Fair enough. It's interesting. I was, I was very young when this was all happening. I would have been, I guess, 13 when Heroes Reborn happened. It's interesting because I'd seen your Avengers, those 2 one-shots, but then I think the first consistent Iron Man I read at the time was Heroes Reborn, and it really did get me in. So I guess it succeeded in that part of its job. And then I went back and, kind of absorbed all of Iron Man's history and really loved the character. But I guess technically Heroes Reborn did its job, even if it was kind of unfortunate that they felt they had to do that at all. Which is unfortunate, because, again, I would have liked to see more Teen Tony.
Yeah, I would have liked to written I would have liked to have written more Teen Tony, but the backlash was not good. People were not happy about Teen Tony. Mostly people don't like change, or comic book fans don't like change. You can bring them around to it eventually, but you have to have the time and the space and the resources to do that. Otherwise, they're just going to be like, well, why isn't this the way it was when I was 12 years old? Be like, well, the world isn't the way it was when we were 12 years old. If we were still writing comics the way they were when I was 12 years old, there'd be no cell phones, there'd be no computers. And in fact, that was an issue when I remember when I was writing Spider-Man, I remember Danny Fingeroth, I did a scene with the cell phone, and he said, no, we can't have cell phones because all of Spider-Man's history is supposed to have taken place over 12 years. And I'm like, I didn't understand. I got that, but that was a loose thing. And if we were just going to ignore the march of technology, that was crazy to me. It would be, honestly, cell phones took away a lot of drama because I'm a soap opera watcher, and I can't tell you how many times I watched people on General Hospital have to give birth in an elevator before cell phones or they were trapped in a cave-in before cell phones, and then, of course, they were forced to have sex for the body warmth there. But once they had cell phones introduced to soap operas and comics, you get out of those situations really easy. And I'm going to be late. So don't sleep with whoever you're hanging out with right now because you think that I'm blowing you off. Those kind of things took away a little easy drama on our parts, but that was our job to figure out how to make drama out of those.
I will say one thing I really liked about the run on Teen Tony is the fact that you didn't forget all the other characters that were already part of adult Tony's life. You still had drama going on with Stark Enterprises and being bought up by Fujikawa. Like, you were still developing and using a lot of those characters, and it would have been really easy not to. But instead, you did devote page space to saying, like, we're not done with that part of the world yet. We just happen to be focusing on Teen Tony, but these things are still important and they still exist.
It might have been easy not to, but it would have been disrespectful to the readers that you asked to get invested in those characters and those storylines along the way. So if you ask them to get invested in it and they do, and then you just abandon it, that's really disrespectful. And you want to make a transition as easy as possible for them. If they still see people around and supporting cast around that they're comfortable with, that they understand, that they know, they're more likely to welcome in these new cast of characters that they don't know. They don't feel like everybody's been abandoned for this.
It's interesting because, like, when I think about Iron Man over the last, 10, 20 years, it doesn't really have a supporting cast like this anymore. Like, it was really varied. You had a lot of different characters, and it was a whole other element. And I think part of that, I know that people think that, secret identities are hokey, but I think it added so much because it wasn't just he's Iron Man, so he's just going to talk to Iron Man people. Like, you had Tony dealing with Tony stuff and Iron Man dealing with Tony stuff. Iron Man stuff, and you had these separate worlds, and so you had a large, rich tapestry of supporting characters as a result.
I 100% agree, and the supporting characters were the characters you could do more with. You always knew you weren't going to be able to change too much about Tony Stark, unless you killed him and brought back his team self, or Peter Parker or anybody, but you could have the other characters evolve and mature around them. It also brought them back down to earth. It's what made them a little more relatable. If Iron Man's just hanging around with Avengers, that's hard for a reader to identify with. But if his secretary also has a crush on him, but his chauffeur has a crush on the secretary, there's great drama there. There's sexual tension. There's stuff you can play with there that's fun for the writers and hopefully for the readers as well. I think it's been a great disservice to comic books. You look at Spider-Man, there's no human people left in his supporting cast. MJ is Venom. Flash Thompson became Agent Venom. Everybody, I guess Aunt May and J. Jonah Jameson, but everybody else has taken on some kind of super heroic identity, which I think dilutes the specialness of the main character in a book where you have 15 superheroes, unless it's Avengers or X-Men, where it's supposed to be a team book. But if it's a single character book like Spider-Man, that's where the heroics should focus, in my mind. I hate seeing that everybody's involved in the superhero world now.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I'm going to let you go in a moment because we've talked a lot about Crossing and Iron Man. I really appreciate it, but I can't leave this unattended. This one other thing. Right around this time, you are starting to work more in the X office. You're writing X-Men, but then you do a miniseries, Rise of Apocalypse, which seems more present, more important now that we're getting X-Men 97, which is definitely cribbing off of elements of your miniseries. I'm curious where this book even came from, because at the time, Apocalypse was kind of on ice. He had been used in Age of Apocalypse, but he wasn't really as much around. So then they do this kind of flashback miniseries. I'm curious what you remember working on it.
So I did not pitch that. They approached me, the X-Men office approached me to write it. I believe Adam Polina was drawing it at that point.
That's right.
They already had the artist on board. So they knew pretty much what they wanted to do. It was loose. I think they said, origin of Apocalypse. We know he was around back when Rama Tut / Kang the Conqueror, Immortus, was there. We want to have some interplay there to tie him into the Marvel Universe more. And let's just see how he rose from basically being a slave to the all-powerful being he was. That was a lot of fun for me because not a lot had been established about that. So it was really wide open for me at the beginning when I dove into that. And I enjoyed it a lot. And I enjoyed Adam's artwork tremendously.
I was going to say, Adam Polina, especially of the time, had such a distinctive style, which was very unique and different than most other artists. So I'm curious, were you still doing Marvel Method on this particular book? And what was it like to be dialoguing, the pages that came in?
Yes, I've only ever worked Marvel Method. I've never written a full script in my life. I would be terrified to do so. And again, when you have artists like that and the pages come in, I worked with, as editor, Alan Davis on Excalibur for years and years, and I just loved opening up those FedEx packages when they came in. And then when I wrote an X-Men annual that Alan drew, it was the joy of my life to see my ideas brought to life by Alan. And again, it was an example of everything was way better than I pictured it in my head. And the same was true, well, except that I wasn't writing it, Weapon X. Every time Weapon X pages came into the office when I was editing Marvel Comics Presents, it was just like, oh my God, this is just such joy to be looking at this and experiencing it and being the first to get to experience it. That's really a big part of the fun of this industry. It's getting to see what collaborators do with your work.
Now, I mentioned Rise of Apocalypse because obviously they are using elements of it for X-Men 97, the current animated series. Did anyone ask you about that before it started coming out?
No, absolutely not. No, I heard about this from other fans and other professionals asking me if I was, collecting anything on this. I had not heard anything so far, but I do have a deal with Marvel where if they use my material, theoretically I should be compensated for it. So we will see how that plays out.
Have you watched it at all?
I have not yet, but I plan on it this week.
Okay, well...
I never even watched the first season. And everybody says it's so great. So I want to watch the first season first.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, again, Terry, thank you so much for coming back and chatting about The Crossing. It's been an absolute pleasure to get your insights on what was going on when you guys were writing these books. Do you have any final thoughts or things you can promote for you?
Howard Mackey and I have a company called Inksmith.com. It's INKSMYTH, Inks and Myth, and we do custom comics as high-end gifts for people. So let's say you commissioned us to do it as a gift for a friend of yours. We would interview you about your friend's strengths. We would turn that into a power set and a superhero identity. We'd ask what obstacles they've overcome in life. We'd turn that into the antagonist. And then we would pepper it with childhood pets and street names and schools and old friends. And that's one thing I have going on. And then I am executive editor for 24/7 Comics, which you can find online, 24/7 Comics. We have a number of titles out, and we're about to launch. In fact, it's leaving house this week, if all goes well. I think it'll be on the stands in November. It'll be an anthology. It'll be a flip book. 24/7 Presents on one side, done in the same spirit as Marvel Comics Presents. It'll be multiple different stories, some of them standalone, some of them chaptered stories. And the other side of the book will be 24/7 Comics Spotlight, where we'll be reprinting material that was done by other publishers but is creator-owned. And maybe they didn't feel it got the marketing it deserves, so we're giving it another chance and publishing it out there.
That's awesome. How long have you been involved with 24/7?
Over a year and a half, 2 years maybe. I started out, I met the publisher at a convention. I was at a panel heckling Jay Lee, and he followed me out of there and asked if he could interview me for their YouTube channel. I did. Then he stayed in touch, and then they had a title they were working on called Loathe, Loathe. I loathed the title because it was too difficult to pronounce. And they felt they could use some help, editorial help. They didn't really have an editor. Carl Choi, the publisher, was acting as the editor, but he'd be the first to tell you he didn't have any of those skills. So I worked on that. We changed the title to Heroes Be Damned. Great title. Vince Sinico is the writer, artist, incredibly talented guy. Always been hesitant about writer-artists unless they're Alan Davis or John Byrne or Walt Simonson, because sometimes the writer in them will take a shortcut figuring the artist can pick it up or vice versa. But Vince took no shortcuts. It's a great story. First 3 issues are out there, and I just spoke to Vince today, and we're about to dive into the next 3 issues.
That's great. Excellent. Well, people should check out that material. But yeah, thank you again for joining me, and maybe we'll have you back. Hopefully it doesn't take another 10 years.
Anytime, Adam. It's always fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.